Welcome to the 19th video in our series of projects and quilts using 5-inch squares or charm packs. The pattern is called Charm Wednesday and it uses 9 charm packs or 170 light squares and 170 dark squares. This quilt has a block A and a block B. Block A has a light center, a dark inner ring, and a light outer ring with 4 dark corners. Block B is the opposite of that, with a dark center, a light inner ring, a dark outer ring, and 4 light corners. We'll be making 10 each of Block A and Block B. My cutting instructions will vary from the pattern instructions. I'm going to eliminate 4 seams per block to help make everything go a little bit faster. So it'll be a little less cutting, a little less sewing, and a little easier to organize. The first thing to do is to open all the charm packs and lay them out so that you can see all the colors. The first fabrics we're going to pick from the charm packs are going to be our inner rings. So it'll be 4 charm packs, 3 that will be cut into rectangles, and 1 that will make the star points. So I'm trying to find matching pieces that are all the same or similar, and I need 4 for each set. So I need 10 sets of light, and then I'm going to need 10 sets of dark. A lot of my charm packs had 2 fabrics that were the same, so I was able to get sets that had 2 of one charm print and then 2 of a different charm print. So 4 squares total, but 2 each of 2 different prints. You could also use 4 completely different fabrics in the charm pack as long as they're all light colored fabrics or dark colored fabrics. I would find the 4 that looks good together in my view, and then I would pin them together. And then I did the same with the darkest of the prints. So I'm leaving out most of the colors. I'm going for the dark prints on black. If you'd prefer to have a little more continuity with your pieces, or they're all the exact same fabric on that inner ring, you could pick 4 fabrics from charm packs that are exactly the same. So get 4 of one type of charm pack. Or buy a layer cake instead of 4 charm packs and then cut it into 4 charm packs. When choosing the charm packs for this particular project, I decided to go with Ruby Star Society charm packs because they all have kind of a similar vibe and great coloring when they're all put together. And then the other 3 charm packs I threw in were just kind of like backgrounds or tonals so that there was a little place to rest your eye on some of these prints. And I went with different charm packs instead of picking 4 that were the same because I wanted mine to have a real scrappy feel to it. So now I have my 10 sets of 4 light squares pinned together, and I also have my sets of 4 dark squares pinned together. I have 10 lights and 10 darks. These lights and darks will make the inner ring of the block. The next thing that I'm going to pick from my charm packs is going to be the outer ring. I'm going to need 8 charms of a similar color. So 8 red charms, 8 yellow charms, 8 orange charms, or at least get as close as I can to the same color. Many of the charm packs had 2 matching fabrics in them, so I tried to keep them together when possible. As I found my 8 squares that were the same color, I would pin them together and set them off to the side. I needed to have 20 sets of 8. Some of the sets will read light and some of them will read dark, and I kind of separated them as I went along. If you're not finding what you need with your charms, you can always look through your stash and find a suitable fabric and cut 5-inch squares to go with your pieces that you have from your charm packs. Some of my sets of 8 had 4 different fabrics, 2 squares of each fabric, and some of the sets had an oddball piece thrown in, so maybe 3 sets of 2 and then 2 that were not matching anything else. But it doesn't really matter. You could have them all be different fabrics, or you could cut ones that you like and have them be all the same. Now I have all the sets of 8 collected that I need, 20 sets of 8. Some of them are light, some of them are dark, and these are going to be the outer ring of the block. And there's still plenty of charms for our next section that we need to pick, and that's going to be the pieces we need for the corners. I needed to pick the outer ring first because it requires more blocks, and then I knew from the leftovers I could pick the 4 corners because those 4 corners don't need to match each other, they just have to be a similar color. So you need to collect 4 squares of a similar color and pin them together. Again, some of these will be light and some of these will be dark. Because my quilt is going to be pretty scrappy, I didn't get too worried about which pieces I was putting together. I just was trying to have fun matching up the fabrics. Now that I've found my 20 sets of 4 fabrics for the corners, some light and some dark, I can move on to picking the center squares. 9 charm packs is 378 squares. The quilt top actually only uses 340, so you will have 38 squares left over at the end. So from the remaining squares on the table, I need to pick the 20 squares that are going to be the centers of the blocks. A lot of the fabrics that are left on the table are going to be more in the medium range, not light, not dark. So I'm going to try to pick the lightest ones and then the darkest ones for the centers of the blocks. I'm also thinking I want to pick kind of the coolest fabrics for the center of the blocks, and I want to find the ones I don't want to leave out. Now that I've finally figured out the 10 lights and the 10 darks, I can pin those together and set them off to the side. I'm going to keep the remaining charms that are left over. There should be 38 of them, and I'm going to put them together in a bag. I'll keep them handy in case I make a mistake on cutting or if I decide I want to put a different fabric in a certain block. The next step in organizing is to put the blocks together and separate out the pieces so that I have one block in a bag. So I'm going to make sure I have 20 blocks all separated out by their colors. We're going to lay out our light squares, those are the center squares, and we're going to pair them each up with a set of 4 dark fabrics for the inner ring. I just picked the dark fabrics that I thought looked best with the light square that was going to be in the middle. For these blocks, all of them, what you want to do is create contrast between the center fabric and that center ring and the outer ring and also the corners. Now I've chosen the dark for the inner ring. I need to find the fabric for the outer ring for each of these sets. And I'm just going to pick the fabric that I think looks the best with both of the pieces that are already there. This quilt is kind of going to be a controlled scrappy look versus a totally random scrappy look. Once I've decided on the color that I'm going to have for the outer ring, I'm then going to pick my corners. So I want those to be a different color than the centerpiece and the inner ring and the outer ring. Each of these piles should have 1 square for the center, 4 squares for the inner ring in dark, 8 squares for the outer ring in a color, and then 4 squares for the corners. And then I'm going to put each of these piles in its own bag, so each block gets its own bag. Now that I have my 10 A blocks all put into bags, it's time to work on the B blocks. For the B blocks, we will start with 10 dark center squares, and then we'll add in the light inner ring. Once I've matched up all the lights for the inner ring, then I find the outer ring colors. Once I've placed all the outer ring pieces, then it's time to figure out the corners. Once the corners have been decided, it's time to put each of these blocks in its own bag. The sorting might seem to take a lot of work, but it only took one afternoon to get all of that done, and it really will help in the future to get the blocks made correctly. I'm going to store all these bags together in one bigger bag, and then every day or every other day I'm going to pick out 1 or 2 blocks and make just 1 or 2 blocks a day. If you only made 1 block per day, you'd still have this quilt top ready to sew together in less than 3 weeks. My cutting instructions will vary from the pattern. I'm going to eliminate 4 of the sewing lines in the blocks to help kind of speed the block up just a little bit. I cut the pieces for my blocks as I was going to sew them. So I would locate the center square, the pieces for the inner ring, the pieces for the outer ring, and the 4 corners. The center square needs to be cut 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. For the inner ring pieces, you will pick one of the lights and cut it into 4 squares that are 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches. The other 3 squares for the inner ring fabric will be cut into 6 rectangles that are 2.5 inches by 4.5 inches. I would usually cut the 4.5 inch mark first and then the 2.5 inch mark to get the rectangles. All the pieces for the outer ring need to be cut at 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. I would usually stack 4 charms together and then trim 2 sides, turn my smaller mat around, and trim the last 2 sides to get a perfect 4.5 inch square on each of those cuts. For this particular part, cutting the squares, and you have to cut all 4 sides, it would be nice to have one of those spinning mats where you could just spin it and then cut the other sides. But instead, I use a smaller mat on top of a bigger mat to get the same effect. The 4 pieces for the corners also need to be cut at 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. If you stay to the end of the video, I'll show you a cute little idea you can use to use some of those tiny scraps that you're cutting off. Or if you prefer, you can just throw those away. There are a lot of fun little ways that you can use those tiny little scraps. And one way is to use it on those rope bowls. You can wrap it around the rope and use it in that. But there's no shame in just tossing those little pieces that you might never use. I'm going to pin my pieces back together and then take them over to the sewing machine and start making blocks. I would only cut however many blocks I was planning to sew that day. Sometimes it was 1, sometimes it was 2, sometimes it was 4. I highly recommend sewing just 1 block at a time. It's tempting to try to get ahead of yourself on this one, but it really is easier to keep it all separated and sew as you go. I would start by separating out the 4 corners and laying them off to the side because I won't be using those till later, and then separating out the outer ring squares, 4 in each of these 2 piles, and then I have my rectangles. I need 2 to put on either side of the center square, and then the other 2 sets need to be sewn end to end to make a longer rectangle. The first thing to do is to put the light squares right sides together on the outer ring fabrics in one of the corners, and you're just going to sew corner to corner. Now you can either draw a line and then sew on the line, or you can use the diagonal seam tape to help make that a little easier and not have to mark each of those squares. Once I finish sewing the diagonal lines, then I would sew one of the rectangles to the center square. Set the other one off to the side, and then once that's done, you're going to take the remaining 4 rectangles and sew 2 sets together that are end to end. And I'm not one for wasting fabric too much, so I'm going to sew a second seam 1/2 inch away from that first seam on those diagonal lines so I can have an extra square of 2 triangles to use in another project. I'm going to make something really cool someday out of all those little 1/2 square triangle blocks. It's not going to be next week, but someday. The last step is to sew the other rectangle onto the opposite side of that center square. Then I'm going to cut the diagonal seam in between those 2 sewing seams, and then I'm going to head to the ironing board to get all of these pieces pressed. If you have one of those little wool mats and a small iron to set up right next to your machine, this would be a great time to use it. For the rectangles that are sewn end to end, I would press the seam open. It'll create less bulk later on when you're adding in more pieces. Press the rectangles opposite each other from that center square away from the center square. For the triangle corners on the squares, press toward the triangle. And while you're at the ironing board, you might as well press those little half square triangle blocks because you're going to want them pressed someday anyway. Someday you'll be thankful that you pressed them all when you were just ironing everything else. Once everything's pressed, head back to the sewing machine for the next round of sewing. The first thing you want to sew together are the squares for the outer ring. You want to make sure that the triangle points towards the needle and that the square without the triangle is on the left side. So put those together, make sure you're sewing it correctly. Sew all 4 sets of those the same exact way. Once those are done, you're going to want to sew the rectangles onto the opposite sides of the center square unit. The center unit, press away from the center square. For the outer ring pieces, you want to press towards the square without the triangle. Sew 2 of the outer ring units to the center square, making sure that you have the light triangle next to the rectangles. Sew the corner squares onto the other 2 outer ring rectangles. When I had 2 squares that would match for the corner pieces, I would try to put them on the same side of those side pieces. That way they would be opposite corners on the block. The blocks were really quick to sew together once everything was cut, and since you'd already organized everything, they were really fun to make too. So sometimes I would say, I'm only going to make 1 block, and then 4 blocks later, I'd be like, oh, it's late, I should go home. It also helped that I was using really fun fabric and couldn't wait to see how the blocks turned out. Once all these are sewn, it's time to head to the ironing board. You're going to press towards the outer ring squares. I usually pressed the long rectangle pieces from the back side because it was easier to adjust the seams, and then I would sew the larger center unit from the front. If you're always pressing to the outer ring fabric, your seams will nest together when you go to sew the long rectangles to the center unit. Now we just have 2 seams to sew and our block is finished. And remember, as you sew these last 2 seams, you want to make sure that the triangle is next to the inner ring fabric. Those little triangles will make kind of a little star out of that inner ring. Double check that you've sewn the block correctly, and then it's time to press. Press away from the center of the block. Each of these blocks will measure 16.5 inches by 16.5 inches. Each of these blocks turned out so fun, and I love all the color combinations. Some of the blocks have a lot of wild fabrics in them, and some are a little more subdued. They've got a lot more solid looking fabrics in it. And that's what's going to make this quilt sparkle, is all the different fabrics mixed together. And now that I have the blocks done, it's going to be a trick figuring out how to lay these out. The first thing I'll do is separate it into light inner rings and dark inner rings, because you're supposed to alternate between light and dark inner rings. I started out by alternating the inner rings, dark, light, and then just randomly put the blocks in place. I then take a picture with my phone and then look at the picture on my phone instead of in real life. And then that kind of tells me what I need to change. In the first picture, I thought the bottom row was too light, and then the second picture, I thought it was too dark. So then I kind of moved some blocks around and came up with this final setting. And then I sewed the rows together one at a time and would lay them back out, and I refer to my phone to make sure I was putting them in the right order. Being able to reference the phone to see how I need to sew things together has prevented me from making mistakes, so I use that method a lot. When I was pressing the rows, I always pressed towards the block with the dark inner ring. That way, when I sewed the rows together, all those seams at the corners would nest. Once the rows were together, I picked out a backing and then quilted it on my long arm quilting machine. For the thread color for quilting, I picked a soft palette of sherbet colors in a variegated thread, and it kind of seemed to blend in with all the different colors on the quilt top. I did a stipple design, which I can do pretty quickly, and it doesn't distract from all the lines on the quilt. I think it really blends in well into the background. The batting I chose for this project was warm and white. For the binding, I picked a Ruby Star Society fabric that's kind of a pink purple, and it's just a little pin dot, and I picked it because it also matched the fabric that I chose for the backing. For the backing, I chose a pink fabric that is from the Create Joy project, one of those lines. And this is just a tone-on-tone with a couple different colors of pink in it. I am very happy with the way this project turned out. And this is a project I think I would do again just because it was fun. The blocks made big blocks and used big pieces. So putting it together was not as time-consuming as you'd think. Now for the bonus information. I like to make little cards using those little cutoffs. I just sew those pieces to some cardstock. I cut the cardstock into 2 chunks and then fold those in half and just sew the fabric right in place. They're quick to make and they use up those little scraps of fabric. You could make as many or as few of these as you want. I also had 38 charm squares left over and a little pile of the half square triangle blocks. Now we're moving on to the charm pack update. Before I started this project, I had 58 charm packs. This quilt used 9 charm packs, and yes, I had some leftovers, but I used up 9 charm packs. That leaves me with 49 charm packs that I still have to keep making videos for you to watch. Make sure to give us a thumbs up if you like the video. Leave a comment for us. Let us know if you like the quilt and what your charm pack pile looks like. Share with your quilting friends and subscribe. Thanks for watching and happy quilting!